Afreximbank's new president, Dr. George Elombi, has unveiled a 7-point agenda with a strong focus on domestic value addition and reducing raw material exports. And Ayuk, the executive chairman of the African Energy Chamber, describes the vision as significant and monumental for the continent's industrial future. In a chat with me earlier at Afreximbank Investiture event in Cairo, Ayuk emphasizes that achieving this transformation will depend on reliable energy access, which he calls the key driver of Africa's industrialization journey.
I think this is a speech that really outlined an African agenda, but not just an African agenda, but a global agenda that reflects Africa as well. I think it's one of the most towering speeches that you've seen with a big focus. I'm an energy guy, so I wanted you to understand what we would talk about: oil, natural gas, beneficiation of minerals. And I think it was right on point, because I think him being very clear to talk about bauxite in Guinea being processed in Guinea, Nigeria being processed in Nigeria, South Africa, Cameroon. And that is exactly what Africans want to see. They want to see us use our resources, process those resources, use it to manufacture and grow Africa. So you have a Pan-African institution that is saying that's the way to go, and they're going to put money behind it. So I see a leader who comes in with a clear vision and really big focus. But watch this. He talked about breaking down barriers, not just trade barriers, but also barriers when it comes to visas. And that is something so significant. We can't talk about goods and services moving across the continent, but people can't move. And so I think he was really clear. And I think this is something that is going to go down monumental when it comes to a leadership speech that defines the future. This speech came from the heart of Africa to the soul of Africa. That's what's great about this speech.
Yeah, because you cannot solve the jobs problem, the poverty problem, without solving the industrialization problem.
Absolutely.
And these are all linked.
And what do you need to industrialize? You need energy. You need to provide the right kind of energy that you need to industrialize Africa. You need to look at him outlining a vision that takes Africa to be competitive when it comes in the race for critical minerals, beneficiations, but also artificial intelligence, AI. So we're going to have to generate that energy that goes to the future, but then you need those financial powers that are there to really drive it. So you're seeing a transformational leadership that is coming to Afreximbank, and that is what you would call next generation. And him actually putting a case for young people means that we're talking to Africa, but then also brings a vision where action and really financing is going to come to deal with those African causes that have long been neglected.
Because you hit the point of the head. They're talking about financing, and he talked about resource mobilization, more or less now looking at global Africa at this time, because he's talking about scale, getting the diaspora involved in bringing capital to the continent. We've seen that play increasing more recently when you look at Africa and how we're going about capital. Understanding a bit more why domestic capital is important, and also trying to source that from where we can back into the continent. Let me get your honest take on that as well.
I think there's a big take. $2.4 trillion private capital in Africa. We're not really doing our best to exploit that and grow Africa. We heard from the Caribbean, from the St. Kitts Prime Minister. He talked about building banks and seeing where St. Kitts came from. We're seeing that building. Global Africa. We're getting the Caribbeans. We're getting the diaspora. Big part of African investments around the diaspora. That is going to be tapped in, and we need to look at that. But the challenge in there, which I really love the fact that Dr. Elombi is discussing, that we're going to have to deal with an enabling environment, because we got to do that above ground risk. That enabling environment is really what is going to drive us to be able to be competitive. So you know what happens with that? We do what we've seen in America and Europe. We have African hedge funds, African private equities, African family offices, African funds driving African development, because they understand risk. They understand how to really be able to look at the guy who doesn't have a credit score, but still bet big on him and drive up our continent forward. That is what that vision comes in. And now we start to redefine the whole financial game that has been rigged for a long time against small businesses, against African entrepreneurs, against those African startups, African tech entrepreneurs, and all of that. So now there is hope. And that is really what I think this monumental transformation in Afrexim really signifies.
Yeah, because he's also talking about creating an enabling infrastructure for trade. And as an oil and gas guy, I'm thinking here, it's very critical when you look at what's happening there in terms of having shared infrastructure across countries. When you look at issues around gas, for example, and the challenges that we face with many pipelines that are trying to cut across many borders. Let me get your assessment of that as well, and how that will move the needle immensely for oil and gas investments.
It would be a game changer. Let me tell you, our infrastructure deficit right now, you need $18 billion to close African infrastructure deficit just to refurbish refineries, deal with storage facilities, and all of that. We need to invest bigly, because it's bankable to build pipelines across Africa. When you compare to Europe and America, Africa, we don't see pipelines. So when you get pipeline across Africa, you know what happens? We'll be able to pipe gas through Africa and deal with energy poverty. We'll be able to pipe petroleum products and ensure that if Europe, because of CBAM or other regulations, are not taking our oil or gas or our resources, we have a 1.5 billion market that can take those resources and really be able. You can't talk about finding to ship resources to Europe and America and Asia for them to process and send it back when you have hundreds of millions of Africans, 600 to 700 million, no access to electricity, 900 million, no access to clean cooking technologies. We could use LPG to really drive that, but we build that LPG infrastructure to take care of villages, small communities. So what does that mean? We stop polluting. We capture gas that's being flared. Think about this. Norway, 4 million people, uses more energy than Nigeria, DRC, Angola, and Zambia combined. We can then turn that around and use gas that's being flared to really do that. So we're using a domestic obligation to really drive that. And you know what's even funny? It can be monetized. It's beneficial. We've shown that it's commercial, especially with gas, LPG, and we are dealing with African problems. That's what this is about. And at the same time, we're fixing these issues around climate change that Africans didn't cost it, but now we've been made to pay being victims of it. And I think we are seeing a new leader that is going to build upon what Professor Arama has built on. They have been a tag team together, and I think that vision lives on, and that vision is going to carry forward. And I'm very excited to see a lot of African energy entrepreneurs like Owando, Dan Code here today. We believe that
and this is talking about doubling, more or less one of the big stories of the day. Yes, Dr. Elombi said that during his speech, that Dangote has confided in him to say, you know what, I'm looking to double this and I need about $5 billion to achieve this. Let me get your thoughts around that.
The groundwork has been set. It was a big plan, big moment. I think most people didn't listen to that. They're going to double capacity. So you know what you're going to see? You're going to see the single largest refinery in the world, in nowhere else but this great continent, Africa. And in nowhere else but Africa's greatest nation, Nigeria, that is going to be not only the country that deals with its own energy security, but deals with Nigeria and Africa's energy security. And that is the beginning of when you see how giants play. And I think Aliko Dangote should be protected, should be enabled to carry these on, because that's what is going to make our continent better. Who could have imagined that an African would be the one driving this, as well as in the past? We had to go to Europe. We had to go to America to look for those big billionaires, investors that can bet big on this continent. And I think Afreximbank moving with him hand to hand, dealing with that. You could imagine how much that does with our energy poverty issues. But even look at it. It's not just going to be about refining. It's going to also be about urea, ammonia, NPK, fertilizer plants. You know why that is even more important than even refining? That gives us fertilizer to produce food. You realize that we're getting food out of Ukraine and Russia, countries that are at war and still have to feed Africa. We would have to feed ourselves and create more jobs, more opportunity, expand tax base, multiply opportunities. So our young people don't have to cross the Mediterranean to go to Europe to get jobs and get opportunities. They'll find jobs right here at home. And Dangote is being a catalyst for that, and it would really drive up African economies and increases government revenues in our continent.